Hello and welcome to Series 3 of Crisis What Crisis, a podcast designed to be a useful field guide as we all try to navigate and continue to come to terms with a dramatically changed world. Whether personal, professional or both, crisis is without doubt the new shared experience. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. For the last 5 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking as the first lockdown began that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experience of those whose lives have properly unravelled. So in Crisis What Crisis, I talk to the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. Some names will be familiar, some less so. Our guests share their experiences, though, with honesty, often with humour, but always in the hope that they might be useful to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Put simply, these are crisis conversations worth sharing. Stay tuned at the end of the episode when I'll give my thoughts and takeaways, the lessons, if you like, for when life unravels. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do subscribe and give us a rating and a review. It really helps make sure these stories reach an even wider audience of people who may find them useful. And that, in the end, is what it's all about. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being, whether it be music for meditation, to help focus, sleep, stress relief, yoga and fitness, rejuvenation, even grief and loss. Mindstream is there to improve human performance. I've tried it, it works, and I'd recommend having a listen to the Mindstream catalogue yourself. Just search Mindstream, that's mind with a Y, on Spotify. Thanks again for joining me. My guest today is the former Government Minister Tracey Crouch. Tracey is one of those MPs who restores your faith in politics. Talented, no nonsense, and a woman who knows her own mind. That she's also a devoted Spurs fan, I think, is another key indicator of her all-round brilliance. But Tracey, the MP for Chatham and Alresford in Kent, is also an incredibly resilient individual, handling a number of professional and personal crises without a scintilla of self-pity, but with bucket loads of determination. At work, she found herself in the headlines when she resigned as Sports Minister, a job she loved, on a point of principle over a government delay in dealing with the menace of fixed odds betting terminals. She later turned down an offer to join the Cabinet to ensure her son was settled in school. But more recently, last June in fact, Tracey found herself facing down an altogether more serious crisis, a diagnosis of stage 2B breast cancer and the gruelling chemotherapy and radiotherapy that followed. Those treatments, I'm delighted to say, are now over, and Tracey is looking forward, in her rather brilliant words, to max out on life. Tracey Crouch, thank you for joining us on Crisis What Crisis. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Let's start with life as a Spurs fan, shall we, Tracey?
Yeah. Crisis? What crisis?
Exactly. I've always said to my sons, who've never forgiven me for indoctrinating them as Spurs fans, that it's training for life. You know, that cycle of hope, very occasional glory and disappointment. I assume you'd agree with that.
Oh, totally. And one of the first things that I did was buy my son a Spurs kit, because I kind of sit there and think that, you know, if I've had to deal with this throughout my entire life, then he can too. I sort of kind of see it as my means of ensuring that he understands what pain and hurt and disappointment is. Exactly. You know, if you're going to learn those things in life and how they're all part of the general fabric of life, then at least learn it through football rather than in other ways. But it's been an interesting season. I think we started so full of hope, as is always the case, and
exactly.
And then, you know, here we are, mid-table, potentially not even knocking on the door of Europe. So
it has. It's absolutely, this season has absolutely been a sort of microcosm of what it is to be a Spurs fan.
Well, the only thing I always try and look at the bright side of these things, and the one upside for me is that I'm a season ticket holder. So I haven't actually lost any money this year because of the pandemic, watching them be bad. So, I think it would have been even worse if, my season tickets were still costing me the fortune.
I had the conversation. I'm a season ticket holder as well, and I had that conversation with Spurs very recently and reflected in exactly the same way. Well, thank God it hasn't cost me any money.
Exactly.
But you're also an FA qualified football coach. You've played a fair bit of football. So sort of joking aside, it's been a big part of your life, hasn't it? And presumably it's been, an important one in the tough times. We sometimes forget, I think, the importance of the things that we love, aside from our families in those moments. I mean, is that true?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, football has always been a big part of my life. And in many ways, perhaps it is the starting point of how I cope with things in life. So, for example, I grew up in the 80s. Girls weren't really encouraged to play football. I was banned from playing football with the boys at playtime at primary school. I went to an all-girls school where football just wasn't even offered. And it wasn't until I went to university that I actually played my first competitive game of football. And yet I played football, when I came home from school at the weekends and everything, just with my mates out on the street. And, I look back now and think, with the grown-up hindsight that I have, that obviously it was unfair that I wasn't allowed to play football at school. But at the time, I wasn't even conscious of the idea that somehow that this was unfair or that I was being treated differently. You just got on with it and I guess I accepted it because, I was a young school child, but, and I just didn't really think about it in a sort of kind of an aggressive, hostile way. I just thought, fine, I'll play netball and rounders, but at home I'll play football.
Yeah, you got on with it.
Yeah, I just got on with it. And then, I did all the things that, football things that weren't related to playing. So collected my Panini stickers, did swapsies in the playground. I could kick a ball until the teacher told me that I wasn't supposed to be there. And so on. And I just then used to just play on the streets when I got home.
Let's talk a bit about your journey to becoming from those streets, to becoming a government minister. You grew up in Kent, not a political family. I think I'm right in saying your mum's was a social worker. You were obviously pretty diligent at school, and as I understand it, law seemed to be the most likely route, I think, at one stage. So what was the trigger to politics? When did you start to really think, actually, I'm more interested in this than I thought?
Yeah, actually, it was a bit of an accidental introduction into politics because it was all down to having an A-level subject clash. I wanted to do AS Maths, and I wasn't able to do it with the two other preferred A-levels that I'd chosen, which was history and English literature. So I just chose politics, and I just thought, oh, it sounds interesting. Didn't really think anything of it. I don't consciously remember being at home having political conversations. No. I mean, we must have watched the news, but yeah, I still.
So what about politics in a sort of more general sense? What about issues? Was there a sense of, because you're someone who is, as I said in the intro, right? You know your own mind, and you're a woman of principle, as we'll get into in a little bit more detail later. But as a teenager or as someone who's going into their A levels, were you already kind of leaning towards issues? Did you have that kind of sense of injustice about things? I mean,
no, not really. I was too busy playing football. Honestly, genuinely, I just didn't think of these things. And I think kids today are well more engaged in politics and current affairs than I was. It was the era of things like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and all that sort of stuff, and and I just didn't. I guess I just didn't consciously clock issues as such. We must have had discussions over the dinner table about things. My mum was probably quite left leaning, so I remember her telling us stories about how she'd gone on some Mrs. Thatcher milk snatcher rally or something or other when she was in her teens. But again, I was like, that's literally it. That's all I can remember. Because I played. I would come home from school, I'd do my homework, and I'd go out until I was told I had to come in. I just don't think that happens now.
So you did your A-levels, you went to uni.
I did my A-levels. I had a really, really good teacher, actually. And I think, actually, the thing that triggered a real interest, and I think it's what's triggered an interest now in youngsters today, is I was doing my A-levels during the Maastricht crisis. So I actually just started my A-levels just as John Major took over as Prime Minister, or shortly after John Major took over as Prime Minister. And then obviously we then had, a couple of years of Maastricht and the election, the 92 election in between. And that just, it was something that was real and relevant and interesting. And John Major, for me, I appreciate this sounds bizarre to kind of most people, but I found John Major really quite interesting. He sort of spoke to me because there he was from a low-income, divorced family. And thanks to his grammar school education, and I was in a grammar school, he'd worked his way up through into where he was, in government, and there he was as Prime Minister. And it was all about meritocracy, and it was about providing opportunity. And, and I actually thought, if that working class man can do that, then, the sky's the limit, really. Although I've never wanted to be Prime Minister. But, it did actually inspire me to think, perhaps I could do something similar. And then again, I was, as you say, destined to do law. And then I saw it just complete happenstance, really. I saw a course at the same law school of law and politics. And I thought, well, I'm quite interested. I'm obviously, just getting good grades. So I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I really enjoyed it.
And then out of uni, you worked as a chief of staff eventually for the shadow cabinet members. You worked for Michael Howard. But you clearly, the sort of tribal bit of politics was not attractive to you. That was not part of the motivation. Being in a team, yes. But you strike me, if I'm wrong, tell me, but you strike me as someone who's not particularly tribal.
I am to some extent, but I'm not a wagging finger, pointy, wavy type tribalist. So it's a bit like going back to football. I'm a Spurs fan who doesn't stand up because they hate Arsenal. Because, actually, I would never support Arsenal, but I can sit there and think, well, actually, they do have some good players and some of their tactics are interesting, and perhaps we should think about the formation. And, it pains me to say, but Arsene Wenger was clearly, extraordinarily talented and things like that. So, but I would never dream of supporting Arsenal. And I think the same is true in politics. I am a conservative through and through. Cut me in half and I would bleed blue blood. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that everything Tony Blair did was awful. And I don't necessarily think that everything that the Labour Party put forward as a proposal is dreadful just because it comes from Labour. And I think sometimes, we've just got to get away from that and recognise that some of the best policies come out of consensus. And working together and cooperation. And, I found that my attitude in the chamber of not standing up and being, this sort of kind of naked tribal Tory means that I don't get shouted down across Parliament. I don't get, booed or harangued or anything like that by colleagues on the opposite benches, because I don't go into that. And likewise, I don't do the same to them. So, I just think it's about having an open mind about policy, really. Yeah,
no, well, I'm with you. How did you, once you were there though, how did you deal with, because that tribal, the less attractive element of tribal politics is there, right? And we've seen it actually not even partly, we've seen it within the party, obviously through the whole Brexit process. How did you, arriving in Westminster, how did you deal with that? Because, it wasn't a crisis, but it was a challenge, one imagines. To navigate that, to work all that out. arriving, or had you seen enough of it already, frankly, from an advisor point of view?
I think I'd seen enough of it. And also, because my time in Parliament had been my previous time in Parliament had been at two very different times in political kind of fortune. So, for example, I was there between 1996 and 1998. So I'd actually worked for a whole group of MPs, 5 MPs actually in total, of which 4 lost their seats in 1997. And Michael Howard was the only one that survived the cull. And actually that was a crisis in Conservative Party politics. There was an identity crisis. There was also this sense of feeling of people had survived the car crash, and they didn't quite know how to deal with that themselves. So, that you had a lot of angry people who had lost, and then you had a lot of people who were unsure how to feel because they had won. And so that was a really interesting period. And then I was back in again between 2003 and 2005. Again, working for Michael Howard as leader, albeit I was working for his cabinet members or shadow cabinet members. And there was a different sense. There was a sense of optimism. There was a sense of Labour Party fortunes beginning to turn. And although we didn't win the 2005 election, it didn't quite feel like it was a crisis. It didn't feel like it was the end. And certainly after David Cameron won the leadership election that followed, there was a real sense of hope and a different. And so it didn't really feel like a crisis. So when I got in 2010, although we obviously hadn't won a majority, I think there was still such a large sense of optimism about the result and the huge number of new Conservative MPs, the number of female MPs, the number of MPs who represented different types of seats. So my seat, traditionally a Labour seat, very urban, very working class, and all of a sudden it's got a Tory MP. And so, that sort of kind of felt like a real change. So although it could have been seen as a crisis, and there have been many books written, obviously, about why we didn't win the 2010 election and what coalition meant, it was just one of those things that you just carried on, walking down that path, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we did our best, I think, to turn it into a positive, and the new intake was a fundamental part of that. And the sun was shining, and press conferences were being held in the Rose Garden and all that stuff. It was a golden era.
It was, and I actually think history will be kind on the coalition.
Yeah, I agree.
I still talk with colleagues now very fondly about the coalition, and there was some, there were struggles. Let's not pretend that it was all sunshine and joy, but there were real struggles, and there were rebellions, of which I was normally part of. Yeah. But we got stuff done. And we got stuff done on a really good, one nation agenda. And I felt very comfortable with the direction of travel most of the time with the coalition. I think I rebelled quite a lot. So it might not look like it from my record, but actually I think it was something that we will look back much more favourably than we perhaps thought of at the time.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let's talk about your resignation in November 2018. You'd pushed for the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals, described by the government as a social blight. There was no disagreement about that at all. Everyone was in violent agreement about it. And for that stake to be reduced from £100 to £2, and that was set to happen from April 2019. But then it was delayed by 6 months. You believe because of presumably pressure from the betting industry. Your resignation took a lot of people by surprise. Tell me about the thought process, because you've described it as a very easy decision for you.
It was a remarkably easy decision, and actually it was a crisis in government that was completely unnecessary, because, as you say, we'd already sort of had the battle about the stake reduction, and that was all settled, and we'd agreed that. But the introduction of it was something that the Treasury didn't particularly want to do. So the policy was very much in DCMS. It sat in DCMS department, but the implementation was in the Treasury. And it was quite clear that they were going to start dragging their heels. People just didn't believe that I would give up the best job in government over what they thought was 6 months delay. But what they hadn't quite realised was that, one, I became increasingly suspicious of Treasury motives. And actually, if you look back at what happened in 2019 with all the Brexit shenanigans and delays on everything, I'm pretty certain it wouldn't have been introduced at all, not even in October 2019. And I wasn't willing to defend the delay. I'd met people who had contemplated suicide because of gambling addictions. And, for me to look them in the face and look them in the eye and say, oh, it's okay, it's only 6 months. I wasn't going to do it. It was not my policy, and I wasn't going to defend it. And I had spoken to people about me resigning over it. They just didn't believe it. And so, that was their problem, really, because what then happened, obviously, is I did resign. Government was left with sort of universal condemnation as a consequence. I had cross-party support, including from people that you would never dream of thinking that they were on the same page in terms of gambling, such as Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example. We managed to put down an amendment to a finance bill that would have effectively starved government of revenue unless they changed it to April. And so they capitulated less than 10 days, I think it was, 2 weeks later, and accepted it and pushed it in the April. So it was completely unavoidable, really.
But your resignation was unavoidable. I mean, you could have made a decision, actually, do you know what, it's 6 months. And you didn't do that. And the reason you didn't do that is because you meant what you said, and because you could see that a 6 month delay was going to create crisis for a large number of people, because you'd spent a lot of time kind of looking at the real impact of these machines. This wasn't just one of those kind of fly-by-night policy positions that you took. You felt it, right? You spent time around the families who were affected.
Well, it took us 3 years to get to that point. I mean, the first thing, when I walked into office after David Cameron appointed me in May 2015, I met all my teams on the first day, and I said to the gambling team there and then, I want a review of fixed odds betting terminals. And it was May 2018.
Tracey, I'm really sorry. We've got a bit of banging. Would you mind?
Oh, it's the cat. Sorry, it keeps going through the cat flap. Sorry. Crisis, what crisis?
Crisis, what crisis?
There's nothing I can do about it. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. We'll carry on.
So yeah, we just keep that in. It just shows that we can work through these issues. But yeah, so it took 3 years to get from me asking the gambling team to review stakes, through to the policy being announced. And in that time, I've met many people who were deeply affected as a consequence of these machines, and indeed other forms of gambling, not just these machines. And I remain convinced that my resignation was the right thing to do, not least because only this morning I got an email from somebody saying, "You saved my life." And this is 2 years on from my resignation. Wow. And I think it's things like that's what made it easy. When you said, I think when you split up with somebody, you split up the partner, there is this moment where you sit there and think, oh, maybe I've done the wrong thing, or, perhaps I should have given it a bit more time and everything else. And actually, it didn't feel like that at all. And I had no regrets. And I think that probably just shows you that it was the right thing to do.
There must have been a part of you, though, or a voice, presumably not a very loud one by the sounds of it, but a voice that was saying, well, if I do this, the door might shut forever, right? There might not be a route back to a big, really interesting, challenging job at some other point in my life. I mean, I don't think that's how it's turned out at all, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But at the time, you're making the decision on the basis, well, do you know what? I might well be saying goodbye to another ministerial job.
I didn't really care, to be honest with you. The reason being that I've been described as a reluctant minister in the first place. So for me, being in politics isn't about climbing a ministerial ladder. And David offered me the one job in government that I wanted. If he'd offered me something else, I wouldn't have taken it, because I didn't want to be a minister for the sake of being a minister. I had no kind of desire to be walking around full of self-importance with a red box. You know, there's more to life in politics than having a red box. So, I wasn't really fussed. But he offered me the job I wanted, and I wanted to do that job exceptionally well, and I threw everything into it for 3.5 years. So I didn't feel that I was walking away from something in the future, because I already had what I had achieved, what I had wanted to achieve in ministerial terms. So I still feel that now. You know, if I get offered a job in the next reshuffle, I think about it. If I'm not, it doesn't bother me. It's not. I'm not fussed about it. I don't want to be prime minister, so going up the ministerial ladder is not. I mean, say if I was offered a cabinet role back in sport, then fine, I'd take it. But if I was offered welcome pensions or the environment or something, I wouldn't, because it's not. I don't want it for the sake of it.
Your resignation was unusual for another reason, because it took people by surprise, but it was also a resignation sort of curiously devoid of the usual histrionics. And I've been in and around resignations. I'm a resigning recidivist, as you know, but also from a political point of view, I was around when others were having to, through the expenses, Farrago, for example. And more often than not, it would, a resignation would be followed by a period of drama and histrionics. Yours wasn't. I've resigned. This is why I've done it. Thanks very much. I've got nothing more. I've really not got anything more to say. That was quite an unusual approach in politics.
I don't really want to be a celebrity for certain things, to be honest with you. I'm not a particularly confident media performer. I don't really covet a lot of attention. My ego is secure enough. I don't need.
Isn't that funny? I think you're. And I'm not just saying this because we're sat on a podcast together. You're a brilliant media performer. because what you say is utterly believable. I'm sure anyone's listening to this would already have if they've not listened to you before, would already have deduced that.
Yeah, I'm really crap at lying. I mean, it's honestly, I have never been on any questions or question time or anything. I have refused point blank to do any of those things, because you inevitably end up on the one week where you fundamentally disagree with whatever is in the newspaper that week. And you're right, I'm a team player, but I would be so bad at saying, oh well, the reason why we're doing crap policy X is because and pretending that it's all amazing.
Yeah.
And so I'm just that I guess I'm just I know what my strengths and my weaknesses are, and things like that. But in terms of, I got told very early on by Nicholas Soames, actually, Winston Churchill's grandson, that if I was to rebel on tuition fees, which was my first rebellion in the coalition, do what I had to do, but don't go out and talk about it. Don't try and make yourself a star out of it. He said, you've effectively danced on the grave of your whip. You don't need to go and shout about it on TV. And I thought that was really good, sensible advice. And I've kind of always thought that, which is, I will do what I have to do in the voting lobbies, but I don't need to become a superstar from it.
That's really interesting. Because that distinction between media and politics is one that not every politician understands or choose, or perhaps they just choose to ignore. That there are a lot of, not all, not by any measure, not even close to a majority of all, but a significant number of politicians who think that they're on the set of house of cards, in everything that they do. And that every decision they make needs, therefore, to have some kind of media plan attached to it.
That's true, but some of those colleagues become parodies of themselves, and journos feed off that. If they need a quote, they know who they're going to go to, and actually, what it ends up doing is it dilutes your own influence. So, if MPX is quoted in every single article about the government or the Prime Minister or whoever, then actually their view becomes less interesting to the person that you're trying to damage, because they're just sort of kind of sit there and say, oh, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Whereas if you don't say anything, but then you crop up and say something, people are like, oh, okay, well, maybe we should pay a bit more interest because they've said something that they wouldn't normally go out and say in public.
Yeah, exactly right. Tracey, you seem to take a similar approach, if you don't mind me saying so. With your diagnosis in June, when you were diagnosed with breast cancer. I mean, I've no doubt at all, of course, that there were deeply painful moments of sort of private despair about it. How could there not be in those circumstances? But outwardly, your approach to what is really the sort of worst kind of crisis, the word you used was workmanlike. Once obviously you got over the initial shock of the diagnosis. Tell me if you don't mind, and because as you know, this podcast is geared primarily towards helping people who are going through crisis. Tell me about the diagnosis, if you don't mind, in the first instance, and how that initial reaction, but how you managed to get to that workmanlike approach to it as quickly as you did.
Yeah, I don't mind talking about it at all because I think it helps raise awareness. I think I very much sat in the camp as somebody who, at time of diagnosis, was 44, was fit and healthy, to suddenly sort of kind of find out that you got breast cancer, which in my mind, quite wrongly, clearly, I had always thought of it as something that happens to older and unhealthier people. It was a sort of kind of, it was a shock. There's no other way of saying it. I was genuinely surprised. And then you go through all the sort of kind of mixed emotions of, why me, and everything else. But actually, that was quite a short process for me, because I did become very practical about it. I think a few things. One, I live in my constituency, so I use the local hospital. And clearly, when you're going into either a breast care unit or oncology, which is what you do to start at the start of our diagnosis, and people are recognising you, it's only a matter of time before it gets sold to the papers. And so I wanted to take control of the message, which is why I put out the statement that I did when I did, because it was quite clear that I would very soon be spending more time in hospital than in apartment. So that was sort of kind of, that was the thing. And I would love to, of course I would have loved to have gone under my duvet and sort of kind of pretended that it wasn't happening. But what would that have achieved? And it would have achieved nothing. And so I think there was sort of kind of, there were practical considerations about it. I've also got he was 4 at the time, he's 5 now. There's no way I was going to sit there and not get on with bringing up my son and do it, being a normal mum and just trying to sort of, get on with life, albeit with this little blip in the journey. And I guess the other thing is that I've always considered myself quite lucky with the kind of cancer that I have gone through. And my feeling of this has got stronger as I've spent more time in hospital, because it was caught early. My breast cancer was caught early, so the diagnosis and the outcomes were good. And I didn't lose my breast. I had a lumpectomy rather than a mastectomy. So already I feel lucky for that. It hadn't spread beyond the sentinel lymph node. So again, I felt lucky. It could have been a lot worse, a cancer. And when I was sat there in oncology, having my chemotherapy, seeing people whose chemo is really to keep them alive as opposed to cure them, which is what mine is for, then I just count my blessings, really. So I just, that's why I kind of took on it as a sort of kind of practical thing, which is, you will get through this. It's going to be grueling, but you'll come out the other end, and you can just get on with living the rest of your life.
We ask this question quite a lot on this podcast of people who've been in crisis for a whole range of different reasons. But that resilience, that kind of avoiding the why me bit, how or rather why do you think you have that in you? Can you, what sort of school of thought are you from? Do you think it's sort of luck, or do you think it's upbringing, or do you think that your working life somehow has kind of contributed to that attitude, or something else in your life?
Probably a combination of all of the above, to be honest with you. I think, I did have a good upbringing. We were latchkey kids. My mum hates the fact that we talk about it in those sense, because she thinks that we say that as if it's some sort of criticism towards her. But actually, I think it's the complete opposite. She went out and worked so that we had food on the table. And I'm enormously proud of her for that. But it meant that we became quite resilient and self-reliant at a very young age. And I think that's a blessing. It's a good thing. So say my mum gets upset because she thinks that we're criticising, but it's not at all. I actually think it's turned out really well for both me and my sister. But
your sister is, I'm guessing, equally resilient and takes a similar view.
Yes, although she is much shyer than I am,
right.
or less gobby, if you like. But yeah, she's she works really hard, and she works in a school, and she's had her and her family have had their fair amount of crisis, and they get through it.
Yeah.
And I guess we just get on with it. And again, I think that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Just I ride with it, really. I don't like a lot of controversy. I don't like a lot of aggression, and I don't like a lot of argument, which is I'm probably in the wrong career. But I kind of take that with my cancer as well. I was surrounded by experts. I effectively succumbed to the experts, and I just did as I was told. And I think that made my own journey through the crisis a lot easier. I'm not afraid to ask for help, and I'm not afraid to ask for support. I'm not afraid to not know things. And I think that, sometimes that helps you in a crisis.
You had a great phrase. You said, you had to kind of deal with the challenge of being vulnerable, which was not something that you'd done before. Well,
I had to, again, just get on with it, because I didn't like it. So that phrase about feeling vulnerable was in relation to the beginning of this year, when coronavirus was absolutely ripping through Kent. We now know through the variant. The hospitals were full. I have the privilege, for want of a better phrase, of seeing weekly numbers on hospital admissions, ICU, critical care, and deaths. And so I was fully aware of what was happening in the two local hospitals. And all of a sudden, unlike last year, I had no immune system because of chemotherapy, or rather a battered immune system because of chemotherapy. And I had to start behaving like I was clinically extremely vulnerable, as I had been labelled. And I did to some extent, but I also didn't. It's the rebel in me. So I was obviously very well behaved in terms of personal hygiene, washing and everything else. And my other half would come home from work and wash his hands and face and change clothes before he came near and everything. But then at the same time, I take my son to school. So, he is, as all children of that age are, a complete germ factory. And so I had to be kind of a bit realistic about the fact that, there was going to be stuff that was coming in and out anyway. And I guess I just tried not to be frightened by it, but I was. And where I was particularly rubbish is that I'm not very good at staying indoors, because I like the outdoors. I like being fit and healthy. And I'd suddenly find myself up at like local supermarket and thinking, do you know what? I'm not supposed to be here. And then that's when I'd suddenly think, oh my God, I feel really vulnerable, and get out as quickly as possible. But so it was just managing all those different needs and desires with what I practically should be doing to look after myself.
Yeah. You've, you're being sort of characteristically kind of low key about what you went through, but it was 2 operations. There was a moment, I think, when a scan suggested, thankfully turned out to be not the case, that the cancer may have spread. 8 rounds of chemo, 5 rounds of radiotherapy. You can describe it as tough. It's beyond tough. When you're in the middle of all that, and obviously, how can you not be thinking and worrying about the potential consequences? So you talked about it from a sort of organisational point of view, and how you organised yourself. How were you organising yourself, sort of mentally?
I practice mindfulness. So I do some meditation. I'm not as disciplined at it as others, but I did find that certain points of the treatment program, I was using mindfulness a lot more than at other points. Do you use an app? I do. I have 2 apps, but also we had some sessions in Parliament a few years ago, so I still have the learnings from those practices as well. So for example, MRI scans are particularly horrible, and I would use breathing techniques throughout that in order to cope with that. Some of those MRI exams as well, they're like 45 minutes to an hour long. Yeah. So they're really horrible. So I used a lot of mindfulness. I also used a lot of exercise, which I continued to try and do throughout my treatment. And I find walking and cycling, a great way of calming the mind. I also talk as well. I'm quite open with people about my mental health. It is important to recognise when you are struggling with things. So I would talk to other people who've been through it, and they'd say it's perfectly normal. Did you get some counselling, can I ask? No, but I am due to start counselling next week, because actually one of the hardest things about treatment, and it's very, very normal for people going through cancer for this to be the case, is it's the end which is the hardest point. So when you're going through treatment, you have access to everyone you could possibly think of that you need. You have amazing breast care nurses, you have chemo nurses, you have a 24-hour helpline, you have support from your oncologist, everything you get. Then all of a sudden you're done. And that's the hardest part, because you've suddenly had these big, warm, cuddly arms of the NHS wrapped around you for months, and then they're taken away from you. The other thing is the general fear about it coming back. And so counselling is due to start next week to basically go all through that. The other thing, and I've always done this actually, I was reflecting on this in advance of this podcast, is the other thing is that while it is a crisis, or was a crisis, I always think about how it could be a lot worse. And so it puts your own crisis into perspective. And I remember the first time I did this was when I was at university. I had to have my first ever root canal surgery. And I remember sitting in the waiting room of the dentist thinking, it could be worse. I could be having a bollocking from Professor Birkinshaw, who was the sort of kind of the head of the law department, who had a fierce reputation. And I always now think that, if I'm scared or worried or anxious about something, I do go to the next level of, well, it could be worse because it could be X. And that's how I felt with, chemo. I had minimal side effects. So for me, it could have been worse.
You've also acted as a chemo buddy, I think, for others going through that process. So that presumably as well, kind of being part of a sort of shared experience, the most wretched of shared experiences, I assume also in its own way, was a helpful sort of exercise in perspective and kind of trying to get to the right place on it.
Yeah, and other people are buddies to me. So people who've been through it before me have been my buddies. So I've been able to talk to them. And I think, one of the things about going public about the treatment and everything, the diagnosis and the treatment, was be able to remove some of the stigma around chemotherapy. And I didn't know that I was going to be able to do that. But I've never worn a wig, for example. I never felt the need to. For many women, hair is their identity. But actually, I thought this is a really good opportunity to show that there's more to me than my hairstyle. And I found it quite liberating to lose my hair. I also, when I say to people who are about to start chemotherapy, you have to remember that every person's experience of chemo is different. We have it in our heads, some picture, some image that we must have seen once upon a time of somebody going through chemo. And it's not like that at all. And so whatever happens in terms of that individual's side effects, it will not be as bad as they thought it was going to be, because our head somehow plays this awful image of what it's going to be, and then it's never that bad.
So you found perspective. You clearly, as you just described, found positives. Did you find clarity as well? Are you finding clarity? Through what is the most wretched type of crisis? Is it adjusted your view of the world?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'd always thought about the importance of my family to me. I did recognise in the first lockdown, pre-diagnosis, that perhaps my work-life balance was not as equal as it should be. I think diagnosis subsequent to lockdown, I think really pressed upon the importance of making sure that I spend more time with the family, or certainly when I'm at home with the family, make the most of it. Because I think one of the things that politicians are absolutely dreadful at is turning their phone off or turning their emails off, actually being fully focused on things at home, because somehow we feel that we have to have everything bleeping away at us all the time, because that's, the urgency of the job and, all that sort of nonsense. And actually, I've got really good, I've got into a really good habit of switching off my laptop on a Friday and not turning it back on until Monday, like the rest of the world. And that doesn't mean that the job is any less 24/7, but it's just about having the right levels of focus. So it has provided me a bit of clarity. I've also become really focused on policy areas around issues like well-being, and how we need to kind of somehow get across to people that you can still be quite healthy and well and get cancer. Yeah, because again, I think, we only see the statistics like if you smoke, you're X% more likely to get cancer, or, if you drink more than government guidelines, you're going to get so-and-so disease or whatever. And actually, we're all susceptible to it. It's just some people make it worse for themselves by smoking too much, drinking too much, eating too much, and so on. And I think we need to have a much more kind of focus on what well-being means and how we can all improve our own well-being, but then also acknowledge that we can still come quite poorly.
Yeah. Do you think what we've been through collectively with the pandemic is going to cause a real change potentially in policy? I mean, you've argued for a change in the sort of structure of government. You think there should be a department of well-being. But do you think, because obviously there's the link between obesity and COVID, and in terms of survival rates. I mean, do you think that we are now ready to? Because a lot of this stuff has been around in politics for a long while, right? I mean, you'll remember in 2010, happy indexes and all that kind of stuff. A lot of it was being laughed at that stage, or at least kind of diminished. Do you think we're now ready to start to realise that actually, the NHS is there for people who are ill, but let's spend a bit of time trying to stop people from getting ill?
Well, I'm pleased to say the happy index still exists. I mean, it's not called that anymore. It's the wellbeing index, but it's still there and rightly measuring sort of kind of 40 odd so levels of, of different things that people put down to their own happiness. And I do think that's important. But I do think we are moving in the right direction in terms of well-being. And, for me, I'd love to see something like a well-being budget, something that measures the health wealth of the nation beyond GDP. And other countries are either looking at it or have done it. So New Zealand has done it, and other countries like Scandinavian countries are looking at how they can measure well-being as part of looking at the overall productivity of the nation. And I think that's what we should be doing. I mean, we do it for animals, right? We sit there and we say, happy hens produce more eggs. And yet, we don't actually sit there and think about how we could be doing this for humans. And for me, I know I'm at my most productive when I'm at my happiest. So it just doesn't make sense. And if I'm feeling well, then I'm feeling happy. And I think it may sound airy-fairy, and there are parts of the British media that would scoff at that. But at the same time, I think that we do need to start focusing on us as individuals and see how we can support them to get well. And that doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, having I'm not going to turn into the nation's PE teacher and make everyone run a mile before work. But it is actually about looking at individuals and how, they can improve their own well-being. And by the way, that could be going to a museum. It could be joining some other ramblers. It could be reading a book. These are all we need to sort of kind of think about how we can improve well-being across the country.
It feels inevitable to me, Tracey, that you're going to end up back in government. You turned it down, of course, in 2019. But you'll be characteristically modest about it, I'm sure. But are you thinking at all about what might be down the track?
If the right job was offered, then I would take it now. I think my reason for turning it down in 2019, although gosh, how fortuitous it turned out to be in terms of diagnosis, is I wanted to get my son settled in school. He was starting school this September after the reshuffle. I wanted to get him in. I wanted to get him settled, and that's happened now. It's done. I've gone through this diagnosis. I feel well. I feel stronger, and I'd like to do it, but I don't want to do it for the sake of it. So there's more, as I said earlier, there's more to life than walking around with a red box. And I would happily carry that red box around if it's something that I'm interested in doing.
So we talked about how these experiences have sort of changed your perspective on life. Has being out of Westminster sort of changed your perspective on politics?
No, not really. Because we're all still heavily involved in politics, even though we're just not physically there. I've managed to work throughout my treatment, and actually I felt quite lucky, again, sort of kind of being able to be at home when others have had to go into work at difficult times and found it challenging because of various arguments in Parliament at the time and so on. So, I've had the benefit through the being clinically extremely vulnerable of being excluded from some of that. I found that as well. Again, it was completely fortuitous, but during the 2016 referendum campaign, I was on maternity leave, and I was able to avoid all the hideousness of what was happening in Westminster and watch the European referendum campaign unfold as a punter. And sometimes I think it's really important for politicians to step away from the Westminster bubble and see politics, as a punter rather than as a politician. I
think that's one of your skills, though, Tracey, if you don't mind me saying so. I think you had that before.
I spend a lot of time with normal people, though. That's the thing, I mean, I don't. Yeah. You will find me on a Saturday afternoon down the rugby club. You'll find me on a Thursday evening, in the pub, and it's. Well, not at the moment, obviously. But I
was going to say we may have to put a disclaimer on this podcast.
And I just talk to a lot of normal people, and I live a normal life. I come from a normal background. I get uncomfortable in circumstances where it's beyond what I'm naturally, comfortable with. So, all the glamorous events that I've been to in ball gowns and stuff like that, it's just, it takes me out of my comfort zone. I'd be happy to have a pair of football shorts on underneath, but it wouldn't quite work with the dress. But it's like, these when I went to Buckingham Palace, I met the Queen a few times, and it's, you can't feel comfortable when you're meeting the Queen when, 35 years ago you were climbing trees. But anyway, it's, I just normal people.
But you think when it inevitably happens, let's continue on that basis.
On this
back, exactly, yeah. Let's not even consider the alternative. It's not going to happen. You're around the cabinet table, almost certainly. I mean, what's your view of where the operation is at the moment, where number 10 is? It seems, from my very distant perspective, things have calmed down a bit, actually. Obviously, they've got wind in the sails with the vaccine program, which so far is going very well. We'll see how that continues. But it seems as though, because through that horrible period of Brexit, the government's not quite so thin-skinned, not quite so tribal. Would you agree? I mean, is that when you think about the potential return? Is that how you imagine it?
Yeah, I mean, God, I feel sorry for Boris Johnson, to be honest with you. I think that he never would have thought that this was going to be the first 18 months of his premiership. Talk about crisis. I mean, no one could have seen this coming, and how hindsight is wonderful. But I do think that decisions were made based on facts that were given at the time and so on. But then we've managed to, in true political terms and party terms, we've managed to add crises on top of it. And things that could have, again, been avoided by proper conversation and discussion have then become a crisis in and of themselves. So free school meals is a classic example. Something that could have been nipped in the bud really quite early, became a crisis because a celebrity footballer got involved, and rightly so. And I think Marcus has done a great job, and I wish more footballers would get involved in politics, but that's an aside. And then having dealt with that crisis, instead of thinking, oh, I know, let's try and make sure we don't have a crisis again over the same issue in a different half term, we just bumbled on, and then it came again, and then there was another crisis, and you just think, there was no sort of kind of long-term thinking about it. And I just hope that those days have gone, that actually things are becoming a bit more settled, that there's a bit more focus, there's a bit more understanding of where the public is at on some of these issues, where sympathies lay with the public. And actually, I would say, again, from conversations that I would have in my chemo sessions, with complete strangers on a ward, actually, the vast majority of the public are very, very forgiving of Boris and really sympathetic to the decisions. People will say, well, he may have got it wrong, but hey, we didn't know it was going to be like this, and no one's ever faced a pandemic, and so on. So actually, I think the public are really quite sort of sympathetic to that. We just didn't know to have all the additional rows on top.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think in terms of the kind of handling of the pandemic, that's exactly the right analysis. But there's also, I think it's going to move very quickly to the recovery and those that are most badly affected. You'd love to see the government doing more for the kids that are going to get left behind here, some of the most vulnerable. Thank you, Tracey, for your time.
Sorry.
I really, really enjoyed the conversation. And I'm sure that the people listening to this too will have drawn the same conclusion as me, that we need more people like you around that table in Downing Street. So you don't have to comment. I sincerely hope it happens. I absolutely love the idea of a cabinet member who says, do you know what, whatever you do, don't put me on. Don't put any questions or question time. Just please, because I have to tell the truth. But of course, that's exactly what we need in politics. That's exactly what we need.
Except the thing is, it doesn't always work out like that, because one of the things about Jeremy Corbyn was everyone was saying how authentic he was, and he always told the truth when he was a backbencher and blah, blah, blah. And of course, when you get into the top of politics, your authenticity is sometimes taken away from you. And I always vowed to myself, because I won this seat off Labour, I still consider it a marginal seat, even though I do have a 18,000 majority. But I still consider it a marginal seat. I still think that one day I could lose my seat. And I don't want to be any less of a person than I was when I came into politics. I don't want politics to have changed who I am. And, I want to still be a mum, a wife, somebody who goes to the shop in their slippers occasionally, I still want all that, and I still want to go to Spurs and shout obscenities at the referee, and and all that sort of stuff. So yeah. I just don't want to be a different person, really.
Well, like I say, that's why we need you in politics. I'm going to ask you for your crisis cures. 3 things that you've sort of lent on during those tough times. Can't be another person, so Harry Kane obviously not allowed on this occasion.
Although he did send me a nice message after I.
So I gather, yeah. So I gather that was a good day.
Yeah. 3 things.
So give me your 3 things, please.
Football would definitely be one of them. Love it, and it's a real distraction. Although I don't feel so relaxed by football when I'm actually in the stadium. Yeah. I would say my allotment, certainly outdoor space, so somewhere where you can just go and reflect while being in nature. I think is really important. I find my allotment.
You're a good gardener.
No, dreadful. But things seem to grow and we seem to eat from it. So, yes. But I don't really know what I'm doing. And I'm currently supporting the school. I've given half my allotment to the local primary school, and they keep on asking me all these questions, and I really don't know the answers because I literally just throw seeds in and hope that they grow. But I find actually my mind can completely empty of any stress or trouble when you're sitting there, basically digging over a bed or, well, actually, as I have been recently trying to find worms to put in other parts of the allotment. But anyway,
right.
And I think my third one is reading, but particularly things like I love reading children's books. I like going back to a time where things were just simpler. And I found during chemotherapy, I found it hard to concentrate on really intense prose. So, I've got lots of books, as you can imagine, political tomes of various things that are piling up, waiting for me to read. And I find them quite difficult to read and concentrate at the same time. Whereas dipping back into some old children's books like Stig of the Dump, The Borrowers, Roald Dahl, Swallows and Amazons. They're simpler times, and you can read a book, in a couple of days, or a day even. And I would find that I read The Borrowers, and I hadn't thought about anything other than what was happening, in the book, and it just takes you back to a pure time in, I think, all of our lives, where the biggest worry we had is whether or not we were going to have, chicken Kiev for tea. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone. It's not a stupid thing to do. It's not you shouldn't feel daft doing it. Pick up Stick of the Dump and just go and find a corner and relax.
Yeah, wonderful. Tracey, thank you again. We really appreciate it. It's been great having you with us.
Thank you.
I said in the intro to this conversation that Tracey was the kind of MP who restores your faith in politics. And after an hour in her company, I'm even more certain of that observation. What a fantastic, straightforward and pragmatic woman. Seemingly devoid of the usual politicians' how will this play break on her conversation, Tracey was so utterly authentic and genuine. From the reasoning behind her shock resignation from government through to the trauma of her cancer diagnosis, Tracey, I think, showed herself to be the right kind of team player. Or as she put it brilliantly, I'm a Spurs fan who doesn't stand up because they hate Arsenal. Tracey's no-nonsense approach to her cancer diagnosis last June, a focus on the positives, the importance of perspective, exercise and mindfulness, I think were incredibly useful. And of course, from this week, she'll begin the professional counselling, recognising that it's often at the end of treatment that anxiety can really begin. My bet is that Tracey will be back in government pretty soon, and it's quite likely to be around the cabinet table. And I'm sure that girl from Kent, whose resilience began as a latchkey kid, will do brilliantly. Why? Because I think she's absolutely determined not to let politics change who she is. Or as she puts it, I want to be a mum, a wife, someone who occasionally goes to the shop in their slippers. Oh, and also someone who likes to shout obscenities at the referee. How fantastic. Thanks for listening to Crisis What Crisis. Feel free to send us your feedback. You'll find our contact details and our show notes giving you the key insights from our guests at crisiswhatcrisis.com. There are also links to our newsletter, Facebook page and Instagram. There are more useful conversations on the way soon, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please do give us a rating and a review. Thanks again.